A knock and the rain. The rain fell like it hadn't in years. Thick, relentless sheets that turned the narrow streets of Willow Creek into shallow rivers. The wipers on Caleb Whitaker's aging station wagon fought a losing battle against the water hammering the windshield. He leaned forward, squinting, one hand gripping the steering wheel tighter each time the tires skidded slightly on the slick road. Beside him, his 8-year-old son, Sam, sat in the passenger seat wrapped in a threadbare hoodie 2 sizes too big. The boy's feet barely touched the floor, and his small fingers traced raindrops racing each other down the glass. "Is the bookstore going to flood, Dad?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Caleb smiled faintly, though the tension in his jaw didn't ease. "Not a chance, buddy? Old brick walls? They've been through worse storms." The truth was, he wasn't so sure. The shop, Whitaker's Books and Tea, had weathered hurricanes, blizzards, and 3 decades of customers seeking solace in dog-eared pages. But it had never weathered a storm like the one in Caleb's heart, since his wife, Lillian, passed away 2 winters ago. As they turned off the main road onto Pine Hollow Drive, a flash of movement caught Caleb's eye. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But as the headlights swept across the roadside, the shapes became clear. A woman, soaked to the skin, sat on the edge of the embankment, clutching an old metal lantern that glowed faintly through the downpour. Her other arm was wrapped protectively around a small boy, 5, maybe 6 years old, curled against her side. Both of them looked utterly defeated, as if the rain hadn't just drenched them but hollowed them out. Caleb's instincts flared before his mind could argue. He hit the brakes harder than he meant to. The tires groaned against the wet gravel as the car slowed to a stop. "Dad?" Sam asked, his voice tight. "Stay here," Caleb said, flipping on the hazard lights. He cracked the driver's side window, leaning out into the storm. "Hey, you okay out there?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Her head jerked up, gray eyes flashing with something that was almost fear before it softened into weary calculation. "We're fine," she called back, though her voice wavered like a loose wire sparking in the dark. "Just waiting for the rain to ease." Caleb glanced at the boy pressed against her. The child's sneakers were soaked through, his thin jacket doing little to fight the chill. "You're not going to make it in this weather," Caleb said, raising his voice over the drum of rain on metal. "I've got a shop down the road. Dry roof. Hot tea. Come on, at least get the kid out of the cold." The woman's jaw tightened. She clutched the lantern closer, her gaze darting to Caleb's car, and then back to the boy. "I'm not looking for trouble," Caleb added quickly. "Look, I've got my son in the car. See?" He gestured to Sam, who gave a timid little wave from behind the fogged window. That seemed to make something shift in her. Slowly she stood, gathering the child in her arms. "His name's Leo," she said hoarsely, "and I'm Leona. But we won't be any bother." "You're not bothering anyone," Caleb said firmly. "Come on, let's get you warm." The ride to the shop was silent except for the sound of rain battering the car, and Sam whispering quietly to Leo about which books had the best pictures of dragons. When they pulled up in front of the bookstore, Caleb threw the car into park and turned to Leona. "There's a guest room upstairs," he said gently. "You can dry off. I'll make tea." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the lantern. "You didn't have to stop," she murmured. Caleb shrugged. "Guess I'm not good at driving past people holding lanterns in the rain." Leona's lips twitched, almost a smile. Inside, the shop smelled like old pages and chamomile. Sam led Leo by the hand to the children's corner, the 2 boys disappearing among piles of picture books like they'd known each other forever. Leona lingered near the doorway, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. Her shoulders were tense, as though she hadn't stood still in months. "Tea or coffee?" Caleb asked, already filling the kettle. "Tea," she said softly, "if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Caleb replied. The storm raged on outside, but inside, something fragile and warm had begun to take root. Caleb couldn't name it yet. Neither could Leona. But as the glow from her lantern dimmed in the corner, the bookstore's soft golden light took its place. Shelter from the storm, the bell above the bookstore door chimed softly as Caleb pushed it open, holding it for Leona and her son. A warm gust of air from the old radiator swept past them, carrying the scent of cedar shelves and cinnamon tea bags. Leona hesitated on the threshold, clutching the lantern in one hand and balancing Leo on her hip. The boy's eyes, wide and curious, flicked from the rows of books to the soft glow of string lights draped across the ceiling beams. "You can set the lantern down," Caleb said gently, noticing how tightly she gripped the handle. "We've got plenty of light here." Leona glanced at him, her expression wary but not unkind. "It's habit," she murmured. Sam bounded ahead, his damp sneakers squeaking on the hardwood floor. "Come on, Leo. I'll show you where all the adventure books are. There's pirates and wizards and... oh, dinosaurs too!" Leo looked up at his mother for permission. Leona nodded once, and the boy slipped out of her arms to follow Sam, their small voices fading into the children's section tucked in the corner. Caleb offered Leona a towel from the coat rack. "You can use the guest room upstairs to change. There's a space heater and a few spare sweaters in the closet." She took the towel slowly, her fingers brushing his for a brief moment. "Thank you," she said. "No thanks needed," Caleb replied, already heading toward the kettle whistling softly in the kitchenette. "You'll find the stairs just past the travel books." Leona's footsteps were light as she climbed, but Caleb noticed how they paused halfway up, as if she were memorizing the exits, the layout, the way out. She's a runner, he thought. Someone who hasn't stayed in one place long enough to unpack her ghosts. He knew the type because he'd been the type once too. Ammon it is. Downstairs, Caleb busied himself brewing 2 mugs of chamomile. He set them on the counter and added a generous drizzle of honey to each. The storm outside thrashed against the windows, but the little shop stood firm, a sanctuary of warm light in the cold night. When Leona returned, she was wearing an oversized flannel shirt from the guest room, and her damp hair hung loose around her shoulders. She looked softer somehow, though her eyes were still sharp, scanning the shop with quiet vigilance. "You didn't have to stop," she said again, standing by the counter. Caleb handed her a mug. "Maybe not. But I'd like to think someone would have stopped for me, if our places were reversed." She held the mug close, letting the steam curl up around her face. "Most people don't." "Then maybe most people don't own bookstores," he said lightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Leona's lips twitched in response. "You live here too?" "Upstairs," Caleb nodded. "It's just me and Sam since my wife passed." Her eyes softened, though her posture stayed rigid. "I'm sorry." Caleb shrugged gently. "I don't mind talking about her. Lillian loved this place. Said it felt like the kind of shop where lost people find something they didn't know they were looking for." Leona looked away, her fingers tightening around the mug. Maybe she was right. In the children's corner, the sound of muffled giggles floated through the air. Caleb glanced over to see Sam showing Leo how to stack picture books into a makeshift fort. "They seem to get along," Caleb observed. "They do," Leona said softly. It's been a while since Leo laughed like that. Caleb hesitated, then asked, "You traveling far?" "Far enough," she said, her voice quiet. "We're heading west." At least, that was the plan, until the storm hit. Caleb didn't press her for details. He recognized the tone of someone who had been asked too many questions and offered too few answers. "You're welcome to stay the night," he said instead. "No rush to get back out there in this weather." Leona's gaze snapped to his, guarded again. "Why? Why what? Why are you being so kind?" Caleb exhaled slowly. "Because I know what it's like to need somewhere to rest, even if it's just for a night." Leona studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of pity or ulterior motive. Finding none, she nodded. "All right, just for the night." As the storm raged on outside, the 4 of them settled into a fragile peace. Sam and Leo fell asleep under a blanket in the children's corner, surrounded by stacks of books and stuffed animals. Leona sat at the kitchen table, staring into her untouched tea. Caleb stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "I keep the porch lantern on every night," he said suddenly. Leona looked up. "Why? Habit, I guess. Or maybe hope." "Hope for what?" "That someone out there might need a light to find their way." Leona's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Instead, she turned her gaze back to her tea, the faintest flicker of something unspoken crossing her face. Outside, the lantern burned steady against the storm. A home for strangers. The storm had quieted by midnight, but the bookstore seemed to hold its breath, as if reluctant to let go of the night's fragile calm. Caleb stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out 2 mugs of untouched tea. The scent of chamomile lingered in the air, weaving with the faint smell of old pages and pine from the firewood stacked in the corner. Behind him, the sound of soft breathing floated from the children's section. Sam and Leo had fallen asleep in a heap of blankets and picture books, their small hands clutching paperbacks as if guarding treasure. Leona sat nearby on a worn leather armchair, still and watchful. She had borrowed one of Caleb's sweaters, a forest green cable knit that hung loose on her frame, and twisted her damp hair into a loose braid. In her lap sat her lantern, unlit now but cradled carefully as if it were a living thing. "You can put that down, you know," Caleb said gently, drying his hands on a dish towel. "You're safe here." Leona's eyes flicked up to his, gray and steady, though something in them softened. "It's not about safety," she murmured. "It's about memory. This lantern saw me through nights when there wasn't a roof overhead. When I keep it close, it feels like I still have control." Caleb nodded, not pressing. He understood the need for small rituals. The porch light he'd left burning for 2 years wasn't so different. "Do you ever feel like the world moves on without you?" she asked suddenly, her voice low but edged with something raw. "All the time," Caleb admitted. "After Lillian passed, it felt like I was standing still while everyone else carried on. Even the seasons didn't wait for me to catch up." Leona looked down at the lantern, her fingers brushing over its worn handle. "That's exactly it. The world doesn't pause for grief, or fear, or exhaustion. It just keeps spinning." A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of quiet that held room for breathing, for resting, for being. "You don't talk much about yourself," Caleb said softly. "Creh." Leona gave a faint smile. "I was a paramedic for 10 years. First in the city, then overseas with a humanitarian unit. 2 years ago, I came back to the States, thought I'd pick up where I left off. But it turns out," she hesitated, "it's hard to save people when you're not sure how to save yourself." Her words hung in the air like a confession neither of them expected. "You saved your son," Caleb said quietly. "That's something." Leona blinked, her lips parting slightly. No one had said it like that before. The old grandfather clock in the corner chimed once. Caleb glanced at it, then back at her. "There's a guest room upstairs. Clean sheets, a door you can lock if you want." "I don't want to impose," she said automatically. "You're not," Caleb replied firmly. "You and Leo can stay as long as you need. Tomorrow, the sun will be out, and if you want to move on, that's your call. But tonight, rest." Leona stared at him, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she nodded. "All right, just for tonight." She stood, careful not to wake the boys, and carried Leo gently in her arms. The child stirred, but didn't wake, his cheek pressing against her shoulder. Caleb watched them climb the stairs, the faint creak of old wood fading into silence. When the door to the guest room clicked shut, Caleb exhaled deeply, as if releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned off the lights in the shop one by one, leaving only the porch lantern glowing outside. Its warm light spilled across the rain-dampened steps, a beacon in the darkness. And though he couldn't yet name it, something in Caleb's chest shifted, like a door he'd kept closed was creaking open. Shadows and scars. The morning broke softly over Willow Creek, sunlight spilling through the bookstore's bay windows in long, golden ribbons. Dust motes floated lazily in the quiet air, disturbed only by the faint crackle of the old radiator. Caleb stood behind the counter, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. He had risen before dawn out of habit more than necessity, and found himself listening for sounds upstairs, footsteps, voices, anything to confirm that last night hadn't been some strange rain-soaked dream. At first there had been nothing but silence. Then, faintly, he heard the creak of floorboards and the soft patter of small feet. Sam and Leo emerged first, still in their pajamas, their hair mussed from sleep. They carried armfuls of picture books and chattered about dragons and knights as if they'd been friends their whole lives. "Morning, boys," Caleb greeted, smiling faintly. "Hungry?" "Yes," Sam grinned. "Can we have pancakes?" "Pancakes it is," Caleb said, already reaching for the flour. Leona appeared moments later, her presence so quiet it startled him when he turned. She wore the same borrowed sweater from the night before, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her hair was damp, as if she'd taken a quick shower, and her gray eyes scanned the shop like she was still memorizing exits. "Good morning," Caleb said gently. "Morning," she replied, her voice hoarse as though the word had been unused for days. "You sleep okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Better than I expected." Leona moved to the corner of the kitchen, her hands curling around a chipped mug Caleb had set out for her. He watched as she inhaled the steam from her tea, her shoulders still tight. "You're safe here," he said softly. Her eyes flicked to his. Safe is hard to believe sometimes. Caleb didn't push. Instead, he focused on flipping pancakes, letting the smell of butter and maple syrup fill the space between them. The boys were giggling in the living room, stacking pillows into what appeared to be an elaborate fort. Leona glanced toward them, her expression softening for a fleeting moment before her jaw tightened again. "You're good with kids," she murmured. "I try," Caleb said. "Sam lost his mom 2 years ago. Some days I think he's stronger than me." Leona's fingers tightened on her mug. "You stayed for him." "Of course," Caleb said simply. "Where else would I go?" Leona looked down at the swirling tea, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I left," she admitted. "After Leo's father walked out, I thought I could build us a better life somewhere else. But all I've done is drag him from couch to shelter, state to state. Every time I unpack our bag, it feels temporary, like we're ghosts passing through." Caleb set the spatula down, his gaze steady. "Maybe what you're looking for isn't out there. Maybe it's here." Leona didn't answer. She didn't know how. When breakfast was ready, the boys devoured their pancakes with sticky fingers and laughter that filled the old bookstore's rafters. Caleb watched Leona as she watched them, a shadow crossing her face that he couldn't quite read. Later, while the boys built a cardboard castle in the back room, Caleb found her standing on the porch, staring out at the creek that wound behind the shop. "You seem restless," he said, stepping out beside her. Leona didn't look at him. "Do you ever feel like you're just waiting for the next thing to go wrong?" Caleb leaned on the railing. "Every day for a long time, until one day I didn't. I can't say when it changed, it just did." Leona hugged her arms around herself. "I can't remember what it feels like not to be on edge. Like the war followed me home and set up camp in my chest." Caleb said nothing, but his presence was steady beside her. After a long silence, he spoke. "You don't have to outrun it, Leona. Not here. Not right now." She turned her head slightly, her eyes glinting in the morning light. "You sound like someone who knows what that's like." "I do," Caleb said simply. For the first time, Leona smiled, not fully, not easily, but the faintest curve of her lips like a crack in stone. As they stood there, the porch lantern still hung unlit in the daylight, but something in Leona's chest flickered, as if for the first time in years she might let herself hope. The lantern that stayed on, the evening sun cast long shadows across the wooden floorboards of the bookstore, turning the quiet shop into a warm cocoon of gold and amber. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving puddles that mirrored the sky's fading light. Leona sat at the kitchen table, her fingers curled around a mug of peppermint tea. She had spent most of the day helping Caleb restock shelves, surprising them both with her familiarity with alphabetizing and her knack for balancing precarious stacks of books. Now, as twilight crept in, the shop was still except for the sound of 2 small voices drifting from the children's corner. Sam and Leo were huddled together, building a fortress out of old hardcover books, and giggling as if they'd known each other forever. "They're good together," Caleb said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "They are," Leona agreed, her gaze softening. "Leo hasn't laughed like that in a long time." Caleb moved closer, setting his own mug down on the table. "You know, I keep the porch lantern on every night." Leona looked up, puzzled. "Why?" "At first, it was for Lillian," he said quietly. "After she passed, the house felt hollow." I'd come home and flip the switch like some part of me thought she might find her way back. Silly, I know. It's not silly, Leona said, her voice almost a whisper. After a while, Caleb continued, it stopped being about her. It became a promise, a way of saying that if anyone needed a place to rest, there was light waiting for them. Leona looked down at her tea, silent for a long moment. Then she said, I used to believe in things like that. Light in the dark. People who don't walk away. But somewhere along the line, I stopped. Caleb's eyes met hers, steady and calm. Maybe you didn't stop. Maybe you were just waiting for someone to remind you. A flicker passed across Leona's face, something fragile and fleeting, like a candle struggling against the wind. Why are you doing this? She asked suddenly, her voice sharper than she intended. Why take in two strangers? Why keep that light on? Caleb didn't flinch. Because I know what it's like to need it. The room fell quiet except for the sound of Sam laughing in the distance. You can stay as long as you need to, Caleb said gently. There's no clock here, no one pushing you out the door. Leona's hands tightened on her mug. You say that now, but people always leave. Or they want you to leave before you get too comfortable. I'm not those people, Caleb said simply. For the first time since she arrived, Leona believed him. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep in their makeshift fortress, Leona found herself on the porch. The lantern burned steadily beside her, its glow casting a soft circle of light on the damp wood. Caleb stepped outside, holding 2 mugs of tea. Thought you might want company, he said. She accepted the mug with a quiet thank you. They stood in silence, listening to the sound of crickets and the occasional drip of water from the eaves. You ever think about leaving this place? Leona asked suddenly. Sometimes, Caleb admitted, but Sam feels safe here. And maybe I've had enough of starting over. Leona nodded slowly. I know that feeling. The porch light flickered slightly in the breeze, then steadied again. Do you think some people are just meant to keep moving? She asked. Caleb turned to her, his gaze steady. Or maybe some people are just waiting for a reason to stop. Leona said nothing, but in her chest, something shifted, like a door creaking open after years of being locked. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the urge to run. A call to heal. The next morning in Willow Creek was quiet in that particular way only small towns can manage. No honking cars, no hurried footsteps, just the faint whistle of wind through pine trees and the creak of the bookstore's old sign swaying gently outside. Leona stood in the guest room, folding her and Leo's clothes into their worn duffel bag. Her hands moved automatically, military neatness ingrained into her fingertips. But every fold felt heavier than the last, as if the act of packing alone might pull her away from the fragile peace she had found here. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from below. Sam and Leo were chasing each other between shelves, pretending to be pirates in search of treasure. For the first time in months, Leo sounded like himself, like a child who hadn't spent too many nights sleeping on borrowed couches. A vibration startled her from her thoughts. Her phone buzzed against the windowsill, a number she didn't recognize flashing across the cracked screen. She hesitated, then answered. Leona Hale? A clipped male voice asked. Yes. Who's this? This is Captain Nolan Shepard. We served together in Kandahar. I know it's been a while. Leona stiffened. Sir, I didn't expect. I wouldn't call unless it mattered, he said. I'm overseeing a new trauma integration program for veterans in Colorado. 6 weeks. Intensive. Hands-on work with soldiers transitioning out of active duty. You'd be perfect for it. I'm not sure that's a good idea, she said carefully. Leona, you always said you didn't know how to be a civilian, Shepard said. This isn't deployment. You'd have weekends. On-base housing for kids. And we need someone like you. Someone those recruits can trust. Leona's throat tightened. Her gaze drifted to the duffel bag half-packed on the bed, to the sound of Leo's laughter floating up through the floorboards. I'll think about it, she said finally. Think fast. We start in 2 weeks. And Leona? Yes? You were always the one who held the team together. Don't forget that. The line went dead. Leona didn't tell Caleb that night. She found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to his elbows, humming softly as he stirred a pot of lentil soup. The smell filled the shop with warmth, and for a fleeting moment, it felt almost too easy, like she'd stumbled into someone else's life. "You seem quiet," Caleb observed gently. "Just tired," Leona said, forcing a faint smile. Caleb nodded. He didn't press her. He never did. Later, when the children were asleep in their pillow fort, Leona found herself on the porch again, staring out into the stillness. The lantern glowed steadily, its soft light spilling across the steps. Caleb joined her, a mug of tea in hand. "It's different tonight," he said quietly. "What is?" "The way you're standing. Like you're halfway here and halfway gone." Leona didn't answer. She didn't know how. "Whatever it is," Caleb continued gently, "you don't have to carry it alone." Leona looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of her sleeve. "What if I leave and everything changes?" "Then it changes," Caleb said simply. "But maybe that's not the end of something. Maybe it's just part of becoming something better." Tears pricked at the corner of her eyes. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," Caleb said. "But you don't have to decide tonight. You just have to know this light will still be on, no matter what you choose." For the first time, Leona reached out, hesitantly, and rested her hand over his on the porch railing. They stood like that in silence, two people who hadn't asked for second chances but were starting to believe they might deserve them anyway. Love that waits. The morning Leona left was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. The sky was gray and heavy, and even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. She stood at the threshold of the bookstore, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and Leo clutching her hand. Caleb stood across from her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his flannel shirt, the porch lantern glowing faintly in the background. "You don't have to say it," Leona murmured. "I know," Caleb replied softly. But there were things neither of them said aloud. How the small cabin above the shop no longer felt like a stopover. How the laughter of two boys playing pirates had seeped into the floorboards like sunlight. How the space between them had become something neither was ready to name, but both could feel. Leona knelt down to Sam's level. "Be good, okay, and take care of your dad." Sam sniffled, trying to act braver than his 8 years allowed. "Will you come back?" Leona's throat tightened. "That's the plan, buddy." Leo reached for Sam's hand. "Don't let the fort fall down," he said solemnly. "I won't," Sam promised. When the car's taillights disappeared down the gravel road, Caleb stood on the porch for a long time, the mug of coffee in his hand cooling unnoticed. He'd been here before, watching someone drive away, wondering if the empty space they left behind would ever feel full again. But this time was different. This time he kept the porch lantern on. The days that followed settled into an odd rhythm. Caleb cooked breakfast for Sam, read bedtime stories, and swept the shop floor in the evenings. But everywhere he turned, reminders of Leona and Leo lingered. The spare sweater she had borrowed still hung on the back of a chair. The tea mug she favored sat on the drying rack, as if waiting for her hands. And Sam, he tried to stay upbeat, but every night he placed a paper lantern by the window before bed, whispering, so she can find her way back. Caleb never told him to stop. 3 weeks in, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was uneven, hurried. Caleb's hands shook slightly as he opened it. "Caleb, some days here are harder than I thought they'd be. The soldiers I'm working with are younger than I expected. Some of them look at me the way I used to look at my instructors, like I might have answers I'm still searching for myself. But then I think of Leo sleeping soundly at night and of the porch light glowing in Willow Creek, and I keep going. Tell Sam the fort still stands in our hearts. And tell yourself the same. Leona." There was no return address. Caleb folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his wallet. That night, he stood on the porch and stared at the lantern's soft glow. "You'll come back," he whispered to the night air. "I know you will." As the days turned colder and the trees shed their autumn leaves, Caleb and Sam built routines to fill the spaces Leona and Leo had left behind. But waiting, Caleb realized, wasn't empty. Waiting was its own kind of love. A return to Willow Creek. The first knock was so soft, Caleb almost thought he imagined it. He was standing in the kitchen, the scent of chili simmering on the stove mixing with the faint crackle of logs burning in the fireplace. Outside, the wind carried the first hints of winter, sharp and biting against the window panes. Then came the second knock, firmer, certain. Caleb's heart stuttered in his chest. He crossed the creaky floorboards, his boots silent on the rug Sam had laid out earlier that week. When he pulled the door open, the cold air rushed in, along with a sight that rooted him to the spot. Leona stood on the porch, damp from the night air, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and her field jacket looked worn in the way only a soldier's could. Her eyes, though tired, carried a light he hadn't seen before, one that seemed both hesitant and sure. Beside her, Leo clutched a paper flower in his small hand. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft creak of the porch lantern swaying in the wind. "You came back," Caleb said finally, his voice low and steady. "I didn't want to leave forever," Leona replied. "But I had to know if I could still do it. Still give something of myself without losing everything else." "And did you?" She nodded slowly. "I did. But only because I knew this was waiting." Caleb stepped aside and Leona crossed the threshold, her boots scuffing against the floor. Leo darted forward before she could say anything else. "Sam!" he shouted. A blur of denim and bare feet came flying down the hallway. Sam collided with Leo in a tangle of arms and laughter, the two boys dissolving into happy squeals as they tumbled onto the rug. Caleb and Leona watched them for a long moment, something fragile and warm blooming in the space between them. "You didn't call," Caleb said softly. "I was afraid if I heard your voice, I'd come back too soon," Leona admitted. He gave her a faint, knowing smile. "Is there such a thing as too soon?" "I don't think so anymore." The lantern's glow bathed their faces in soft amber light. For once, neither of them tried to fill the silence. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep in their shared pillow fort, Leona found herself back on the porch, wrapped in one of Caleb's old blankets. She held a steaming mug of tea between her hands, staring at the steady glow of the lantern. Caleb joined her, leaning against the railing. "You're quiet." "I'm thinking," she said softly. "About what?" "How this is the first time in years I'm not planning my next move. Not wondering where we'll be in 6 months or what I'll have to leave behind." Caleb looked at her, the side of his face lit by the soft yellow glow. "What are you doing instead?" "I'm just here," she whispered. "With you? With us." And for the first time since she stepped onto this porch weeks ago, Leona felt something settle deep inside her, not the restless hum of survival, but the quiet, steady pulse of belonging. The porch lantern flickered in the wind and then burned brighter, as if echoing her heart, promises under the lantern light. The first snow of the season fell gently over Willow Creek, blanketing the small town in quiet white. Inside the bookstore, the air was warm and rich, with the scent of cinnamon and pine from the wreath Sam and Leo had made earlier that morning. Caleb was kneeling on the living room floor, helping the boys tie string around scraps of waterproof paper. Leona sat nearby on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, holding a pen poised over her own small piece of paper. "What should I write?" Sam asked, his brow furrowed. "Anything you want to promise the family," Caleb said. "Something big, something small. It just has to come from your heart." Leona smiled faintly. "This is your tradition?" Caleb nodded. "We started it after Lillian passed. It felt like we needed to promise each other we'd keep going, no matter what. I guess it stuck." She looked down at her blank slip of paper, her chest tightening. "You don't have to rush," Caleb said softly, watching her from across the room. "Take your time." The boys were quicker. "I promise to help Leo if he gets scared at night, even if I'm sleepy," Sam declared proudly. "I promise to always share the last cookie," Leo added, though he crossed his arms and muttered, "even if it's chocolate chip." They both tied their papers carefully to the wooden post Caleb had hammered into the backyard earlier that afternoon. A hand-painted sign above it read, "Team Porch Light Est. This year." When it was Caleb's turn, he cleared his throat. I promise to keep the porch light on, not just the real one, but the one in my heart for all of you. Sam grinned. That's a good one, Dad. All eyes turned to Leona. She stared at her blank paper, the weight of years of running pressing down on her shoulders. Then, slowly, she began to write. More work, a good one. I promise not to run when love feels too quiet. I'll stay, even when it's hard. Her hands trembled as she tied it to the post, but when she stepped back, something in her chest felt lighter, like setting down a duffel bag she'd carried too long. Caleb caught her eye, his gaze steady and warm. You don't have to promise that for me, he said gently. I didn't, Leona replied softly. I promised it for us. That evening, after the boys had fallen asleep in their shared fort of blankets and twinkling fairy lights, Leona and Caleb sat on the porch, wrapped in one of his old flannel blankets. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the porch lantern, its glow casting a golden circle around them. You ever think about what comes next? Leona asked. Every day, Caleb said, and I think maybe we're already in it. She smiled faintly, leaning her head on his shoulder. I used to think I was only strong when I was saving someone, but now I think strength is letting someone save me too. You didn't need saving, Caleb said softly. You just needed a place to land. Leona turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I found it. There was no need for a grand declaration or a kiss under the snow, just the steady glow of the lantern, the warmth of two people sitting shoulder to shoulder, and the soft promise of belonging at last. If this story moved you, reminded you that healing is real, or renewed your belief in second chances, we invite you to subscribe to Healing Stories. Here, we share real-life journeys of strength, love, and hope. Stories that speak straight to the soul. Thank you for being here. And always remember, no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back to the light. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know.